With humble acceptance of God's will, we announce the peaceful passing of Paula Ellery Charles, better known as Miss Ellery or Ma Charles, on Friday, 19 July 2024, at her family residence in Soufrière at the age of 82. She was the beloved mother of Mrs. Karen Charles Blackman and Mrs. Charlene Solozano, mother-in-law of Lyndon Blackman and Darren Solozano, grandmother of Dr. Frederick Page, Tristan Solozano, Caden Luke Blackman, and Sandine Solozano. Ellery was sister of Mrs. Justina Flavia, Mrs. Delisha Hinson, Mr. Charles Duplessis, Mr. Collins Duplessis, and Mr. Bernard Lloyd Duplessis. Sister-in-law of Mr. Charles Flavia, also known as Charlie, Mr. Chester Hinkson, Mrs. Christina Duplessis, Mrs. Vina Duplessis, and Mrs. Catherine Duplessis. Niece of Mrs. Ethelyn Mondesi Seville and Miss Phyllis Mondesi of Soufrière. Aunt of Mrs. Jacqueline Duplessis Faraday, Mr. Bradley Flavia, Mrs. Lynette Wells, Cash Jr., Lester and Ricky Hinkson. Aisha, Charles, also known as Junie, Philip and Charisse Duplessis. Wayne Joachim Jr. Niagara Duplessis, Mrs. Sharon Duplessis Smith, Darren, Chanel, Samantha, Jr., Devin, and Devin Jr. Duplessis. The late Orson Duplessis, Mrs. Annalisa Weeks Cleveland and Brian Weeks, Mrs. Nicole Mondesi Rochford and Dr. Brandon Mondesi, Miss Tammy Barrow and Mr. Troy Barrow, Mr. Trevor Allaire, Mr. Kirby Allaire, Ms. Marguerite Ann Allaire, Ms. Vera Allaire, and Miss Agneta Allaire, Mrs. Melina Alexander, Mrs. Michelle Markey Wood, and Mr. Raymond Markey. Cousin to Mr. Carlisle and Miss Carla Gustave, Mr. Michael Gustave, Deligna and Kyle Gustave, Mrs. Lister Renee Mondesi, Mr. Floyd Stanislas, Mr. Bert Mondesi, Miss Lola Stanislas, Mrs. Marilyn Degazon, Miss Juliana Mondesi, Mr. and Mrs. Neville Snack and family, Mr. Dexter Theodore and family, Miss Gisela Theodore, Miss Celia Snack, Mr. Johnson Snack and family, Mrs. Petronise Itali Duplessis, Miss Flora Duplessis, Mrs. Sotera Duplessis, Mrs. Alberta Duplessis Barley, Mr. Vernon Duplessis, Mr. Claudius Odo Duplessis, Mr. Robbie Skeet, Mr. Jerome Duplessis, Miss Christy Duplessis, Miss Valencia Bissett, the Mitchell and Mondesi families in Choiseul and Lapointe, Miss Sheila Prayville, Mrs. Lucille Prayville Chapman, Mrs. Tessa Charlery, Mrs. Lynn Ferrari and Mrs. Cara Payton and family, Mrs. Brenda York. Special mention of Miss Anne Allison Lubon, who was her best friend and family, the Louis Fernand family, Father Festus and Father Albert, many cousins, relatives, and friends, both here and abroad. The funeral service for Paula Ellery Charles, better known as Miss Ellery or Ma Charles, will be held at Our Lady of the Assumption Church, Soufrière, on Monday, 29 July 2024 at 10 a.m. Her body will be interred in the U.S. at a later date. Please note, as we prepare to celebrate the life of Ellery, the family requests funeral service attendees to wear white. In lieu of flowers, please make donations to the Faces of Cancer organization. The funeral service will be streamed live on George Studios' YouTube page. The body now lies at Lazarus Funeral Home, New Dock Road, V4. May she rest in God's eternal peace.